Hi there, I'm Trish from TrishNewbery.com and I'm really excited for the sew along today. This is an above the knee dress with some gathered tears. The front has a binding and a nice little tie off to the neckline. So this pattern is for woven fabrics. I'm going to use a really light polyester, but you can use this in a multitude of fabrics because this pattern, even though it's a woven, you could use this as a winter garment or a summer garment if you like your arms exposed. So there's 2 sleeve lengths, 3/4, which is sort of mid-arm length, and also full length for the winter view. It has a nice little blouse on. So you're going to need some elastic. I've suggested 6mm, 1/4 inch, but thanks to COVID I have only got 1 centimetre, 3/8 inch. I'm going to make it work. The other thing you're going to need is some binding. So you can buy pre-purchased binding in a coordinating fabric, or you could use your own. So I've cut some bias strips out of spare fabric and I'm going to use my binding foot. Right, so I think that's all we need to know. I'm going to use a plain stitch because it's a woven. The seam allowances are 1 centimetre, and I'm going to finish my raw edges with a 3-thread overlock. And I have put a nice new needle in my machine, which I really suggest you do for each new sewing project. This is a 70 to match the weight of my fabric, which is very light. So let's get started. So before we begin, let's just have a quick look at this pattern. In the front we have the slashed area here. So what we're going to do is bind through here, and then we're going to bind around the neckline separately. So a really easy pattern hack, if you don't want the slash with the tie, is just to cut this as all one piece, and then you can have just a very plain top. You'd have to change the construction sequence and bind the neckline, but that's a nice wee pattern hack if you want to do it that way. So what we're going to do is place our front and our back right sides together, and we're going to sew the shoulders in a 1 centimetre seam allowance, and then we're going to overlock those edges to tidy them up. Right, so when you're ready, right sides together, we're sewing the shoulders. Make sure you test stitch on spare fabric before you begin. My stitch length is 20/5, which is 2.5 for most people. Yep, you can tell this is going to be a really slippery fabric to sew. Okay, and then when you've done one, go across and do the other. Okay, and go to your overlocker serger and just serge tidy both of those seams. Here you can see the seam with the serge overlocked edge, and just go ahead and press those seams towards the back, and we'll start working on the binding. I've set up my binder wrong side facing me, and we're first of all going to bind the V part in the front. So this is only a short amount of binding. Make sure when you bind it, if you're using a binder, that you have the right side of your garment up. And to make it easier on myself, what I'm going to do is just open this up when I'm binding it, so it's as if I'm stitching a straight line. Right, so I've just done a small run of stitches just to check my binding's working, and this is really slippery, so it's always fun doing it in front of the camera. I'm never quite sure if it's going to work out. We will give it a try. So I'm just going to feed the top of that V into my binder and start stitching. So when you get to this part, we just don't want any little snags. So just try and make this into as straight as line as you can. So yeah, what we're looking for at the middle of the V is just no puckering and making sure that everything's caught. So what we do now is match that right sides together and just sew a small triangle across the end of this binding right in the center. That's just to create a nice sharp V. So you'll need to change out your binding foot for a plain foot if you're using it, and just stitch across in a triangle. I went and stitched that on another machine because I didn't want to take out my binder and put my binder back in again. So what I did was this little triangle here. So this is right sides together, just sew that short distance there. So what that does on the right side is fluff. It creates a perfect V here for you. Alright, so now we need a nice long piece of binding, and we're going to do the neck edge and the ties all in one. For this next part, you're going to need access to your tape measure. So what we're going to do to create the binding is to run off a length, then bind our neck, and then run off another length. And the length at the beginning and the end are going to be our tie cords. So that means you can change the tie cords to be whatever length you like. Around about 30 centimeters seems to work quite well. That's in inches, that is 12 inches. So anywhere between 20 and 30 centimeters is good. So 8 to 12 inches. Entirely personal. Probably longer if you want to bow this, shorter if you just want to leave it untied or just in a very loose knot. So when you decide on your length, and for this sample I'll do 20, but you could do, as I said, whatever you length. Just start by running on a length of binding. Just make sure your binding's working well. And if you're doing just regular bias tape, just sew it together like you would. And then take your tape measure and measure it as you go. Okay, when you get to the length you feel is correct, stop. Then come back to your garment, and we want to come to the V neck edge. So here's our V here. So I'm going to start on the left side as if you're wearing it, and what I'm going to do is just trim that previous binding directly in line with the neckline, just so it'll be a smooth transition. Then we're going to feed this binding in, or start binding. Okay, now that's caught. We're going to continue around the front neckline, through the shoulder, all the way across the back to the front on the other side. So when you get to areas like this, just make sure you tidy it up by trimming any of your serge threads back, and just once again make sure that seam faces towards the back at the shoulder line. On the other side, make sure you trim that off as well. And then continue stitching the same length of binding you stitched on the other side. So when you've done that, put these two together and match them like so, and come to wherever they match and cut them off the same. Then we're just going to do a small loop knot and roll that down so it's at the very, very edge. And of course, if you've got access to toggles or something like that, end caps, that's a really good idea too. And just go ahead and do that on both ends. now we're working on the sleeves. So the sleeves have a gather at the sleeve head. So come to the curved edge and you will see 3 notches. One here, the center one which will match to our shoulder seam, and one on the other side. So we need to run a gathering seam, a gathering thread between these two notches here, the 2 outside ones. The middle one is to help us mark. So just make your stitch length a little longer than normal, and I'm going to run a gathering thread at 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, just with a longer stitch length than normal. Don't forget to put your stitch length back to normal now. So draw up a small amount of this gather. I'm going to do mine from the reverse. Whichever side you pull, make sure you do it for both sides. Don't worry about the amount too much at this stage, we'll adjust it later. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. Take your garment and place it right side up. Now the sleeve is a dolman, so it's also part of the front. So I'm going to start off by sewing in the sleeve on the left hand side as if you wear it. So taking the sleeve, and they're identical, place it right sides together to the garment. So this sleeve actually runs from the waistline through to the shoulder and back to the waistline on the other side. Okay, so place those pieces right sides together, and we're going to sew a seam at 1 centimetre, matching the notches as we go. Don't forget to back tack at the beginning and end. Okay, so match your gathering notches, so you'll have a notch just short of one side of the sleeve head. And I've done something a little bit wrong. I obviously haven't taken my gathering too far, so I'm just going to incorporate that as part of the gather. So I'll just, a little bit out there, I'll just make it all work in the gather. So we just have to make sure the gathering is sitting on top of each other. Sorry, the gathering notch is sitting on top of the notch on the shoulder. This is a little bit tricky, especially with this slippery fabric. Because this is a dolman, this is you can start experimenting with things like checks and striped fabric. It's really effective because you'll have the 2 different directions on the front and the back of the garment. Okay, so when you have the first notch into place, there's a center notch which matches to the shoulder seam. Make sure that that matches and stitch that down. And then make sure the notch on the other side matches. So it's quite a tight little gather at the top. And just draw up that gather to suit, which is why I pulled the threads for the gather from the wrong side of the sleeve. It just makes it a little bit easier to maneuver. And I'm stitching directly, I was going to say directly on top of my gathering line. It's not, it's just slightly to the side. And then continue stitching down the other side. Okay, so go ahead and repeat that on the other side, and then overlock, serge tidy that edge. And if you want to, you can remove your gathering thread. I don't tend to, but because it's such a small amount, it should easily pull through. Right, so when you've serged that, press it towards the sleeve, so away from the front, and then go ahead and repeat that on the other side. We're just going to jump a little bit ahead now and overlock, serge tidy the lower sleeve area. So you don't have to do this step if you don't want to. I've allowed 1.5 centimetres, which is 9/16 of an inch, for the hem, which is also the elastic turn. So what I'm going to do is overlock, serge the edge, turn it up and stitch it down shortly. If you're going to have a fold, a 5mm 1/4 inch turn, and then a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch hem here, just skip this step. So basically all I'm doing is jumping ahead slightly to save myself time. So I'm coming to the wrist edge and I'm just going to serge tidy the lower edge. And do that at both wrist areas. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you have a serger overlock, do this. If you don't have one and you're using a zigzag, you might be better off with a fold here. So we're still at this wrist edge. Come back to your plain sewer, fold your sleeve right sides together and match that seam. So we're going to sew the underarm and side seam all at once. The seam allowance here is 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch. Repeat that for the other side and then go to your overlocker and serge tidy that raw edge. Now we're going to work on the lower sleeve area. Cut 2 pieces of elastic to the size chart or to your personal measurements. So what you need to do with your elastic, 6mm 1/4 inch recommended. I couldn't find that because of COVID, so I've got 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch. Both should work fine. It's really just down to a comfort factor. So what you do is, if you're using the wrist measurement, the wrist length view, just put that around your wrist and work out where you'd be comfortable for the long view with that sitting. Then allow around about 2 centimetres 3/4 of an inch as a seam allowance. So if your measurement is 21 centimetres, allow 23 centimetres. If you're using the 3/4 view, come higher up the arm to about midway point, measure, and just work out where you want that to sit. Now just bear in mind, if you want it to sit firm, make it tighter, and all of this of course depends on how stretchy your elastic is. So now we're going to create a channel for that elastic to go through. Come to the lower edge and make sure that that seam is facing towards the back of the garment. Tuck the tail up and then fold at the notch position. Now this casing has allowed 1.5 centimetres, which is 9/16 of an inch. And what we're going to do is just stitch a line through that overlocking line. We're just going to leave a very small gap of around 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch at the seam edge here to thread our elastic through. So stitch through that overlocking line. You might find it easier to press this before you sew, just to see how you get on. So when I say leave a small gap, all I mean is wherever you start, leave a gap at the end, like that. And don't forget to repeat that on the other side. Take a safety pin and secure it to one end of your elastic, and then come to that gap and pass that through the channel. Try not to twist it as you go. And then come back out at the beginning position. Now sometimes it's better off that you make your elastic longer to start with, and then you can try this on and adjust it afterwards. So now what we're going to do is just overlap this. It's best to overlap it by about 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch, but that's entirely up to you. And then secure your elastic together whichever way you prefer. Some people prefer to zigzag. I like to do straight lines of stitching up and reverse. So if this is just a temporary measure for you, don't put too much in. If you're very comfortable with your elastic measurement, you can leave it like that. So it's just nice if you need to adjust this, you can then pull it back through the hole, make it shorter, and continue. So then feed this back through the hole, and once you've pulled that back through the hole, just distribute the gather evenly, and all that means is stretch it out and let that gather fall together. And go ahead and repeat on the other side. If you prefer, you can go back and close that gap now, up to you. Now we're going to be sewing the gathered skirt part. So we have 4 pieces of skirt, 2 for the upper layer, 1 front and back, and 2 for the lower layer. What I'd like you to do is overlock, tidy, serge the short edge on all 4 pieces. This will just make our life so much easier when we're gathering. And just repeat that for the other 3. We're going to start on the bottom layer first. Take your pieces and match them right sides together. Now these pieces are different top to bottom. At the top edge, which is the gathering edge, there'll be a notch in the center and at the quarter, and at the hem edge there's no notches. So just make sure you have these matched together, and we're going to sew the side seams together at 1 centimeter, which is 3/8 of an inch. So these are the short edges we've just serge overlocked. And do that for both ends. And now go to your iron and press those seams open, like so. We're now going to hem this layer. Come to the edge without any notches, and I'm going to overlock and then plain stitch my hem at 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. So there's a 1 centimeter hem allowed for. It's not going to matter if you make a bigger hem. Say you could turn up 6 mil and then stitch that down at 1 centimeter, so you have a 1.5 centimeter hem. So you could do a double fold. There's lots of options here, but I'm just going to serge, and then I'm going to press my hem into place. So I'm serging the raw edge, and I'm going to press. So I've serge tidied that edge, and now I'm going to stitch my hem into place. You could do this from the wrong side, you'd find it easier, so turn to the wrong side and stitch through the overlocking line. I'm going to stitch mine from the right side simply because I have pre-pressed my hem at the correct hem allowance into place. Whichever you prefer. I am going to start at a side seam just to make it tidier. So go to your iron and press that hem again, and we're going to work on the upper layer. Place your upper layer pieces right sides together and make sure they are around the right way so that the notches match at the top edge and at the bottom. But we are going to sew the side seams at 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. And when you've done both ends, go to your iron and press those seams open. Before we stitch our bodice to our garment, it's really important that we don't mix up the top from the bottom, simply because of the notch positions. So in the centre we have a notch top and bottom, that's great. On the top edge we have a notch that's closer to the side seam, so it's about 1/3 of the way, so that tells us the top. And the bottom edge we have a 1/4 notch, which is halfway between the centre and the side seam. So it's really important that when we're doing the top layer, that the top layer here is in the correct place. It's up to you whether you want to sew the top to the bodice now or you want to put the second layer on first. I always find it's easier to put the top layer on first. Entirely up to you. But whatever you do, we need to now gather. Everyone's got their own technique for gathering. You can certainly do whichever you find the most comfortable. I tend to only use my plain sewing machine. I use 1 line of stitches. I don't use a gathering foot. As I said, you do whichever process you want. But whatever you do, we need to gather up this fabric and we're going to match these positions. So let's just extend our stitch length longer than normal, and I'm going to do mine at 3.5, and I'm going to run a line of gathering stitches at, I do them at 1 centimetre, which is also the stitch line. You could do them just short of 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, and I run mine front and then back. Pull a long tail and stitch. And a long tail at the end, and then the other side. So the key is really the longer stitch length, and I always draw my threads up from the wrong side of the fabric. So this pattern piece is identical front to back, so if you have a print, choose which print you want at the front, and that will be your front. So I'm going to pop my stitch length back to normal again, 2.5 before I forget, and I'm going to very roughly draw my threads up from the wrong side, and I don't measure it, I just literally just do a very rough pull up. And what I do is I keep an eye on the center point and I try and pull around about the same from that on each end. And then I'll do the other side. Now what I do is I get myself some pins that I can, or clips that I can clearly see where they are, and I find my notch position. So now I go through and I mark my center, well, my notch position. So there'll be one in the center and one closer to the side seam. And I do that for both the front and the back. Take your bodice and turn it inside out and make sure the front is at the front and the back is at the back, and then take your gathered piece and make sure it is right side up and place it inside. So what I've taken a long way to say to you is we want right sides together. So the first thing to do, because we have all this rough gathering, is to start matching our side seams. So just match those seam positions. Then come to the seam on the bodice and match that to the notch position, and do this 3 more times, because we have one on each side of the front and one on each side of the back. And go ahead and match the center notches as well. Right, so when we have all those pins into place, and it does drive you crazy, sometimes gathering really annoys me, but we are going to start at a side seam. So make sure all your threads are out of the way. And I'm going to start at the side seam and sew the back first, just because it sort of gets me in the zone of doing the gathering. So make sure that you have absolutely matched those side seams, and start your stitching. Just make sure you keep those gathering threads out of the way. So we want all the threads out of the way, and just do a small back tack to begin and secure those layers together. And just double check you have right sides together. Alright. So, look for the first notch, check they're on top of each other, and what I find, and now distribute the gathers really evenly. So what I find can be really handy is a pair of long nose tweezers. And this, you just, what I call is eyeball it. So you just want to make sure all those gathers are just sitting really nicely. And then I'm going to stitch almost on top of the gathering line. It's slightly to the left, but only slightly. And just stitch those gathers into place. Now stop just short of that notch, make sure you remove that pin, and then look for the next notch. Check that that is in the correct position, and just rearrange those gathers to suit. If you need to draw it in, draw it in. If you need to stretch it out, stretch it out. It's often good if you stop with your needle down. Okay, so eyeball those stitches, check your raw edges are together, and stitch. And stop before that notch position. Remove the pin and just repeat across the entirety of that gather. coming up on the other side seam now. Double check all those threads are out of the way. Okay, so now you've done it on one side. Just going to double check that that side seam is on top of itself. There we go, and I'm going to repeat this across the front. Okay, so now I'm going to go to my serger and serge tidy those two edges together. So serging that raw edge tidies up all of those little stray threads, keeps it all looking really tidy. Do not press it, don't press your gathers. And now we're going to move on to gathering the lower tier and attaching it to this tier. And it's up to you whether you want to remove your gathering thread or not. If you're sewing this as the peplum top view, what you can do now is go ahead and complete your hem exactly the same way we complete the hem for the dress, which is serge tidy this lower edge, and then we're going to turn it up by 1 centimetre and plain sew. For the lower tier, it's exactly the same process as the upper tier. The difference is the notches are at the quarter way position, so I'll just quickly jump ahead and we can do that. So here I have gathered up my layers, and I have this out, so I'm going right side in, wrong side out. So I'm going to put my skirt layer inside. So all that means, top layer inside, so all that means is we have right sides together. And I'm going to do the same as before. I'm going to find the side seams and match them with the pin. With this layer, I find it easier to match the centres next. And then match the quarter positions. When you have that in position, just like we did before, we're going to stitch this into place so you can just roughly readjust those gathers. But main thing is, start at a side seam, get all those threads out of the way and match that seam perfectly. And then stitch a couple of stitches to secure that don't interfere with your gathering threads, so keep them away from the gathering threads. So just a small back tack, and that just helps us. Then find your first notch position, make sure it's still correct, and adjust the gathers to suit. And we're going to continue stitching around just like we did with the upper layer. I'm not going to record all of this. So just like before, go to your overlocker serger and just tidy up that raw edge. So when you have finished tidying that edge, if you want to, go ahead and remove the gathering thread. And because we've already done the hem, our garment is finished. Thanks for joining me with the sew along. I hope you enjoy the garment. I have to say I've absolutely loved working I hate to say it with polyester, I have always preferred the natural, beautiful fibres like linens and things in summer, which are so good to breathe with. But I must admit I would probably use polyester again. I haven't sewn with it for a long time, but it is just, in this design, it is beautifully soft and drapey, and just looks so pretty. So what can I say about this? Thanks for buying my patterns, thanks for joining me with the sew along. I'd love to see your makes on my Facebook page, and if you've got any comments, please post them below. And if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, and I hope to see you again soon.